She fought to keep up with his long-legged gait. Twice she asked him where they were going, and twice he simply shook his head and refused to answer. They never paused for a breather. And for once, Billy was glad for the physical regime she'd established once she'd taken the job. If she hadn't, she was certain she would have dropped from exhaustion by now. She had no idea how far they went into the thicker part of the woods. Nothing looked familiar. All she knew was that they were moving further and further away from the river. He's a monster. The thought was prevalent, sitting in her brain like a horror movie come to life. She hadn't imagined it. Neither had she imagined the way he had attacked these men. Hitting the guy behind him with the rifle was one thing. She'd seen that move before in TV shows, and she assumed it was also a defensive tactic taught in the military. But the other stuff he did, what he did to those other two after he'd changed. Patrick suddenly paused and looked upward. Curiously, she gazed up at the cluster of white oak trees and tried to see what he was looking at. "What?" she whispered. He finally glanced back at her, a small smile on his face. "We'll stop here and set up camp. Can you build an underground fire pit?" "A what?" "Don't worry, I'll show you how." He proceeded to go into the thicket, leaving her with no choice but to keep going. The trees seemed to close around her as she stepped inside. Patrick was waiting for her next to a large fallen trunk. "We'll be safe here. I doubt whoever sent those men will know about this place." Billy looked around. "You don't know that. I know no one's been this far into the woods other than me." She gave him a dubious look. "What makes you think so?" "Because there are no tracks other than mine." "And you know this because—" "Because I can see them, Billy." He wasn't curt, but by the tone in his voice she knew he believed it 100%. She opened her mouth to challenge him when he held up a hand. "My senses are keener than yours. Trust me on this." She stood cemented to her spot. For a moment she'd forgotten about his transformation. His reassurance had brought the scene on the riverbank back with bloody clarity. When Patrick walked over to her to take the suitcase and small duffel from her grasp, she stepped away in fear. Their eyes met, and she saw the sadness in his green gaze. Bowing her head, she let him take the items so she could relieve herself of the heavier backpack. As she set up the tent and tossed the bedroll and blanket inside, she watched as he took the small shovel from the suitcase and excavated a deep pit in the moist dirt, then dug a second hole a couple of feet from the first one. He then dropped to his knees and began to scrape a tunnel between the two. When he was done, he stood and shook the dirt from his arm. "That'll work better inside this grove, and it won't be so noticeable if any of those men's friends make it this far." He sat on the fallen tree trunk and hung his head, staring at his hands. He was worn out and not yet recovered from his wounds. Still, he seemed determined to get through this with the same grit she'd witnessed when he defended her against those men. Billy remained standing and waited. When he finally spoke again, it was with regret and more than a little fear. "I'm sorry you had to see that back there, but I felt I had no choice." "What are you?" It was growing colder. Her words were white mist. Fortunately, the trees acted as natural buffers against the wind. His head remained bowed. "I'm a shapeshifter. More precisely, I'm a metamorph." "A metamorph. I know the term shapeshifter, but that one's new to me." He ran a hand over his head. Wiping away the moisture, he flicked the droplets to the side. "It's a term given to me by the military. It's supposed to distinguish me from what I guess they assume other shapeshifters are. Can do." He gave a little humorless laugh. Billy rolled her eyes. "Trust the government to try and complicate matters. So how are you supposed to be different?" He lifted his face to glance at her, then averted his eyes. "Most shapeshifters lose their humanity when they change. They become the animal, or whatever they transform into, and when they revert back, they have little or no memory of what occurred while they were in their other self. There are some species where that is true." "But you don't." Patrick shook his head. "No, I remain fully cognizant. I'm still human inside." His tone had gone from fear to deep sadness. It was almost as if a dark, black shroud had wrapped around him.